I'll never forget that weekend. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a break from the daily grind with 3 of my closest friends, Mike, Alex, and Chris. We'd been friends since college, and we were all looking forward to spending some time out in nature, away from the noise of the city. Queensland seemed like the perfect spot. A dense forest, a few hours' drive from where we lived. It was secluded, peaceful, and had the kind of rustic charm that made you feel like you were really getting away from it all. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, and the place was as beautiful as we'd hoped. Tall trees stretched toward the sky, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze, and the scent of pine filled the air. There was a small clearing, where we set up our tents, right next to a river, that wound its way through the woods. The water was so clear you could see the pebbles on the bottom, and everything felt calm, serene. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting hot dogs, and talking about everything and nothing. The fire crackled softly, and the woods around us were quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl, or the rustling of leaves. It was the kind of night where you feel completely at peace, where the worries of the world seem a million miles away. But then, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when we first heard it. A soft tapping sound, coming from the direction of the trees. At first, we thought it was just an animal, maybe a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. But the more we listened, the more it sounded deliberate, like someone or something was tapping out a rhythm. "Did you guys hear that?" Alex asked, his voice low. The firelight flickered across his face, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Yeah, probably just a raccoon or something," Chris said, trying to sound casual. But there was an edge to his voice. We brushed it off, but the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. It seemed to move around us, coming from different directions, like it was circling our campsite. We shone our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing there, just darkness. "Let's just head to bed," Mike suggested, breaking the uneasy silence. "It's probably nothing," we agreed, though none of us seemed entirely convinced. We doused the fire and crawled into our tents, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over us. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring up at the fabric of my tent, listening to the sounds of the night. Hours passed. Or maybe it was just minutes. It was hard to tell. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again, but this time, it was different. The tapping was closer, and there was something else. A whisper, faint and barely audible, but unmistakable. It was a voice, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It was like it was coming from inside my head, slipping into my thoughts and twisting them into something dark. Something wrong. I sat up, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure if I was hearing it for real, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard a rustling outside my tent, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps, like someone was moving slowly, deliberately, just beyond the light of our campsite. I unzipped my tent just enough to peer outside. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. The fire was out, and the others were still in their tents. But I could see movement at the edge of the trees. A shadow, tall and thin, standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight. "Mike? Alex? Chris?" I whispered, hoping one of them had decided to go for a walk. But I knew it wasn't them. The shadow was too still, too unnatural. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly turned toward me. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I felt its gaze, cold and piercing, like it was looking straight through me. And then, without a sound, it started to move, gliding toward the clearing, toward our tents. Panic surged through me. and I scrambled out of my tent, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I shone it toward the shadow, but the beam seemed to pass right through it, like it wasn't even there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about it made sense. That's when I heard the others stirring in their tents, and I realized they must have heard it too. The footsteps, the whispers, the presence that was now unmistakable. Mike was the first to emerge, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing toward the figure. He nodded slowly, his face a mask of terror. "What the hell is that?" Before we could figure out what to do, the shadow stopped, just at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, everything went silent. The wind, the river, even the crickets that had been chirping all night. The air was thick with dread, and we were all frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to dissolve, melting into the shadows of the trees, until there was nothing left but the darkness. The tapping resumed, louder now, coming from all around us, and the whispers grew more frantic, more insistent. They were inside my head, clawing at my thoughts, filling my mind with images I can't even begin to describe. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without a word, we grabbed our things and ran, through the trees, along the river, stumbling over roots and rocks in our desperate attempt to get away from whatever was lurking in those woods. The whispers followed us, echoing through the trees, growing fainter, but never quite disappearing. By the time we reached the car, we were all shaking, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We didn't talk about what we'd seen, what we'd heard. We just drove, away from Queensland, away from the nightmare that had unfolded there. We never went back, and to this day, we don't talk about what happened that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I still hear it. The faintest whisper, the softest tapping, like something is trying to remind me that it's still out there, waiting. George hadn't set foot in Byberry for 20 years. Life had taken him far from the quaint, picturesque village where he'd grown up. But now, he found himself driving down the familiar, winding roads toward his childhood home. His parents were ill, and the guilt of staying away for so long gnawed at him. As he crossed the old stone bridge leading into the village, a sense of unease settled over him. Byberry wasn't the same. The quaint houses and manicured lawns he remembered had taken on a dilapidated, forgotten air. Paint peeled from once colorful walls, and the gardens were overgrown with tangled weeds. It was as if the entire village had been left to rot. When George pulled up to his parents' house, he was struck by how much it had changed. The shutters hung crooked, and the once cheerful front porch now looked dark and foreboding. But he shrugged it off, attributing it to his long absence and the passage of time. He grabbed his suitcase from the trunk and made his way inside. The house was eerily quiet. A chill hung in the air, and as he stepped into the entryway, the floorboards creaked underfoot. George called out to his parents, but his voice echoed back to him, unanswered. The silence was oppressive. He wandered through the house, noting the odd things that seemed out of place. The furniture was coated in a thick layer of dust, and there were no signs of life, no photographs, no personal belongings. Nothing to indicate that anyone had lived there in years. Yet, the lights worked, and the old clock on the mantel ticked away, marking the passage of time. As he moved from room to room, he started to hear noises, soft whispers, the sound of footsteps just beyond his line of sight. At first, he chalked it up to his imagination, but the longer he stayed, the more persistent the noises became. There was a strange presence in the house, something unseen, that watched him from the shadows. That evening, his mother finally appeared. She was frail and ghostly pale, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. George was shocked by how much she had aged, how sickly she looked. She spoke in a whisper, telling him about a man who wandered the village at night, a man who had lost his mind long ago, and now haunted the area. Her words sent a shiver down his spine. Despite his mother's warnings, George decided to attend a party that evening, hoping to reconnect with old friends and shake off the unsettling feelings that had been plaguing him since his arrival. The party was held at a nearby house, and though he recognized some familiar faces, there was something off about the gathering. The conversations felt stilted, the laughter forced. At some point during the night, George slipped outside to get some fresh air. As he wandered down a familiar path toward the old stone bridge, he spotted a young girl standing alone at the edge. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her long hair blowing in the wind. There was something otherworldly about her, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The girl beckoned him forward, leading him silently through the dark woods. George followed, unable to resist, until they reached a small pond surrounded by thick trees. The moonlight reflected off the still water, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Without warning, the girl stepped into the pond, her white dress billowing around her as she disappeared beneath the surface. Panic surged through George, and he rushed to the water's edge, frantically searching for her. But what he saw instead made his blood run cold. The pond was filled with bodies, lifeless faces staring up at him from the depths. George stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. These were the people of 𝕬𝕬𝕓𝕤𝕬, the villagers he had once known, but they were dead, all of them. Terrified, George turned and fled back to his parents' house, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a nightmare. But when he arrived, the house was dark, the windows shattered, and the door hanging open on its hinges. He burst inside, only to find it empty, abandoned. The walls were crumbling, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. His parents were gone, the furniture was gone. The house itself had been left to rot for years. George's heart raced as he realized the horrifying truth. He had been speaking to spirits, to the ghosts of his parents, and the people of 𝕬𝕬𝕬. The village had been dead for years, and he was the only living soul in a place that time had forgotten. Desperation clawed at him as he tried to leave. But no matter how far he ran, the village never let him go. 𝕬𝕬𝕬 had claimed him, and as the whispers in the dark grew louder, George knew he would never escape. The dead had taken him, and he was doomed to wander the village, just like the ghostly girl and the man who had lost his mind. Claire and Kylie had grown used to the quiet, eerie streets after their night shifts. It was part of their routine: clock out, head to the bus stop, and wait in the dim glow of the streetlights until the last bus came rumbling through the deserted town. But tonight felt different. There was a chill in the air that crept under their skin, and the usual comforting hum of the night was replaced by an unsettling silence. They huddled together under the flickering streetlight, glancing down the road, hoping to see the familiar headlights cutting through the darkness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and just as they began to wonder if the bus would ever come, it appeared, a hulking, dark shape emerging from the shadows. The bus screeched to a halt, and the doors creaked open. Claire and Kylie exchanged uneasy glances, but stepped on board. The interior was dimly lit, the usual hum of passengers' conversations replaced by an oppressive silence. They walked down the narrow aisle, noticing only one other passenger, a woman sitting near the back. Her face was partially turned away, but what they could see was enough to send a shiver down their spines. Her eyes were a deep, unnatural red, and one side of her face was horribly scarred, as if it had been burned. The bus jolted forward, and they took their seats, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Claire sat by the window, her eyes drawn to the dense forest that lined the road. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches scratching against the bus like skeletal fingers. As they rode deeper into the forest, strange things began to happen. A black cat, seemingly from nowhere, leapt into Claire's lap, startling her. Its yellow eyes glowed in the dim light, and it stared at her unblinkingly before jumping down and disappearing into the shadows of the bus. Claire's heart raced, but she tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe it had snuck on board at one of the stops. The bus suddenly slowed to a stop, and the doors creaked open once more. A man stood at the roadside, his face obscured by the darkness. He boarded the bus, his heavy boots thudding ominously on the floor. Claire and Kylie watched as he made his way down the aisle, his eyes locking onto the mysterious woman in the back. He took a seat across from her, his gaze never wavering. The bus lurched forward again, and the man's presence seemed to shift the atmosphere. The bus driver and conductor, who had been silent up until now, began to laugh, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down the women's spines. They pulled out a bottle of alcohol, passing it between them, their laughter growing louder and more menacing with each passing moment. Kylie squeezed Claire's hand, her eyes wide with fear. Something was very wrong. The driver, conductor, and the man exchanged dark looks, their intentions clear as they began to whisper amongst themselves. The driver glanced back at the women, a predatory grin spreading across his face, but as the bus trundled through the thick forest, the man's attention shifted from Claire and Kylie to the woman sitting alone. He muttered something to the driver, and together with the conductor, they started toward the back of the bus, their eyes gleaming with malice. As they approached the mysterious woman, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature in the bus plummeted, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing her face in full. Her red eyes burned with a terrifying intensity, and the charred skin on her face seemed to writhe and twist, as if something beneath the surface was trying to break free. Before the men could react, the woman stood up, her form distorting into something monstrous. Her mouth twisted into a ghastly smile, and with a speed and strength that defied logic, she attacked. Her hands morphed into claws, and she tore into the man, ripping him apart with savage ferocity. Blood splattered across the seats, and the man's screams echoed through the bus, but only for a moment before they were cut off abruptly. The driver and conductor tried to flee, but the woman moved faster than their terrified minds could process. She grabbed the conductor, slamming him into the window with enough force to shatter the glass, before turning her attention to the driver. His pleas for mercy were met with nothing but cold, unrelenting rage as she dispatched him just as brutally. Claire and Kylie were frozen in their seats, paralyzed by fear as they watched the horrific scene unfold. The last thing they saw before everything went black was the woman, standing amidst the carnage, her eyes glowing with a terrifying, otherworldly light. When they awoke, it was morning. The harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room greeted them, and for a moment, they wondered if it had all been a nightmare. But the blood on their clothes, the bruises on their skin, told a different story. They recounted the night's events to the hospital staff, who, in turn, called the police. But when the authorities searched the area, there was no sign of the bus, the mysterious woman, or the men who had tried to harm them. It was as if the bus had never existed. The officer in charge of the investigation listened to their story with a grave expression. After a long pause, he spoke. 2 months ago, there was a bus accident on that very road. 4 people died. The driver, the conductor, a male passenger, and a woman whose body was so badly burned we couldn't identify her. Claire and Kylie stared at the officer, their blood running cold. The realization sank in. The woman on the bus, the one who had saved them in such a horrific manner, was one of the dead. The officer continued. The wreckage was cleared away, but some say her spirit still haunts that road, waiting for the right moment to take her revenge. Claire and Kylie exchanged a look, the terror of that night still fresh in their minds. They had escaped, but the memory of the woman's red eyes and the bus that never should have been still haunted them. And they knew, deep down, that some spirits were never truly laid to rest. It was late, far later than she usually stayed at work. The office had emptied out hours ago, but deadlines had kept her chained to her desk. By the time she finally left, the city had taken on an eerie stillness, the usual hustle and bustle, replaced by the lonely echo of her footsteps on the pavement. She hurried to the train station, her mind racing with the unsettling news she'd heard earlier that day. Stories of women being attacked and thrown off moving trains had dominated the headlines, and now, with the night pressing in around her, those stories felt all too close. The platform was nearly deserted, and the few people who lingered there kept their heads down, wrapped in their own worlds. When the train pulled in, its headlights cutting through the darkness, she was relieved to see it wasn't completely empty. She boarded quickly, finding a compartment with only a few passengers. A couple of men seated far down the aisle, and a woman who looked like she, too, was returning from a long day at work. The woman wore a simple sari, her hair neatly tied back, and she looked just as exhausted as the protagonist felt. She settled into her seat, clutching her bag tightly, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that had been growing in the pit of her stomach. The train lurched forward, and the city lights blurred into streaks of color as they sped through the night. Minutes passed in silence, the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks the only sound. She glanced at the other woman, who seemed preoccupied, staring out the window into the darkness. The men at the far end of the compartment were speaking in low voices, their words lost in the hum of the train. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The men stood up, moving slowly down the aisle toward the other woman. The protagonist's heart began to race. She wanted to call out, to warn the woman, but her voice caught in her throat. The men were close now, their expressions unreadable, as they reached the other woman. Something in the air snapped. One of the men grabbed the woman's arm. Yanking her from her seat, she gasped, struggling against him. But he was too strong. The other man joined in, helping to drag her toward the door. The woman's screams echoed through the compartment, piercing and desperate. The protagonist was frozen in her seat, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone, trying to dial for help. But her fingers were clumsy, and the phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. Panic surged through her as she watched the scene unfold in front of her. Helpless to intervene, the men were ruthless, their intentions clear as they wrestled the woman toward the door, trying to force it open. And then, just as the woman's fate seemed sealed, a sudden burst of light flooded the compartment. The door at the far end of the carriage flew open, and a group of police officers stormed in. Their guns drawn, the men froze, caught off guard. And within seconds, the officers had them pinned to the floor, handcuffed and subdued. The protagonist felt a rush of relief so intense it left her dizzy. She watched as the officers led the men away, their expressions cold and determined. The other woman, shaken but alive, was helped to her feet by one of the officers, who spoke to her in a soothing tone. The train slowed to a stop at the next station, and the protagonist finally allowed herself to breathe again. The officers guided both women off the train, into the safety of the bustling platform. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. As she stood on the platform, still reeling from the events, she noticed something strange. The other woman, who had been so brutally attacked, was now standing calmly beside the officers, her expression serene. The protagonist's relief began to melt away, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The woman turned to her, and in the harsh light of the station, something was wrong. Her eyes, once filled with terror, were now empty, almost lifeless. And then, as if in a dream, the woman smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a chill down the protagonist's spine. The officers said nothing, their faces impassive, as they led the woman away, disappearing into the night. The protagonist stood frozen on the platform. Her mind racing, she realized then, with a growing horror, that the woman wasn't like her at all. She wasn't a survivor. but something else entirely. Something that had taken the shape of a victim, only to vanish into the shadows once more. The train pulled away, leaving the protagonist standing alone on the platform, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The night seemed to close in around her, the once familiar city now a maze of fear and uncertainty. She had survived the night, but she knew, deep down, that she would never forget the face of that woman, the face of something far more sinister than she could ever have imagined. And as she hurried away from the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, followed by unseen eyes, waiting for the moment to strike again. In the fall of 1995, the Henry family, Amelia, William, and their 2 children, moved into the infamous Amityville house. It was a decision born out of desperation. The house had a dark, notorious history, one that had kept it on the market for years. The price was too good to ignore. So, despite the ominous warnings, they took the plunge. From the moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with an unseen dread that seemed to creep into their very souls. The walls, once bright and welcoming, now felt as though they were closing in, whispering secrets that no one should ever hear. Within days, their youngest child fell gravely ill, a once vibrant boy, now bedridden with relentless fevers, racked with pain that baffled every doctor they consulted. Amelia spent countless sleepless nights by his side, praying for a miracle. But the illness only grew worse. Their daughter, Ayla, began to feel a presence in her room. Each night, despite the heater being on full blast, the temperature plummeted, turning her room into a frigid tomb. She would lie awake, shivering under her blankets, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching her every move. Amelia, ever the skeptic, tried to dismiss it all as the stress of the move. But the house, with its dark history, began to gnaw at her mind. The stories of the past, the murders, the hauntings, started to feel all too real. One night, as she was preparing for bed, Amelia noticed William acting strangely. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he were a puppet on invisible strings. She called out to him, her voice trembling with fear, but he didn't respond. Instead, he walked downstairs to the basement, his steps slow and deliberate. Amelia followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She found him there, in the dim light of the basement, digging furiously at the floor. His hands were raw, bloody, as if he had been at it for hours. She screamed his name, trying to pull him away, but it was as if he couldn't hear her. Not until she touched him did he react, violently. He lashed out, his eyes wild with something unrecognizable. Then, as suddenly as it began, he collapsed, unconscious, shaken to her core. Amelia knew something was terribly wrong. In the spot where William had been digging, she found a locked box. It was ancient, its surface etched with strange symbols that sent a chill down her spine. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a way to open it. Meanwhile, Ayla's experiences grew more terrifying. She began having visions, horrible, nightmarish visions, of a secret room deep within the house. In it, she saw ghostly figures, chained and tormented, their faces twisted in agony. These weren't just spirits, they were the souls of those brutally murdered in the house, their suffering etched into the very walls. The tension in the house escalated to a breaking point. William's behavior became more erratic, more violent. He was no longer the man Amelia had married. Something else had taken hold of him. Desperate, Amelia decided to break open the box, hoping it might hold the key to saving her family. The moment the box was forced open, the house plunged into darkness. The lights flickered and died, leaving them in pitch blackness. William began to scream, his voice echoing through the halls as if the house itself was amplifying his agony. He thrashed wildly, his body contorting in unnatural ways. Amelia, fearing for her children's lives, made the hardest decision of her life. She grabbed the gun they had kept for protection, aimed it at her husband, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was deafening in the silence that followed. William fell to the floor, lifeless, with tears streaming down her face. Amelia grabbed her children and fled the house, never looking back. They drove straight to the police, her mind reeling from the horrors they had witnessed. But when she told her story, the evidence was stacked against her. The box, the spirits, the visions, none of it mattered. All they saw was a woman who had shot her husband. Amelia was convicted of William's murder, sentenced to life in prison. Her children, traumatized and alone, were sent to live with their grandmother. But the house, the Amityville house, remained, its dark history growing ever darker. And as Amelia sat in her cell, she knew that the terror wasn't over. The house would continue to claim more victims, its secrets buried deep within the walls, waiting to be unleashed once more.